Welcome everyone who's coming to visit on our YouTube channel, and thank you to everyone who's attending live and in person. This is the Wizards of Ox. We are here again to talk all things food today and spreadsheet and how to understand how to use it and hopefully tackle some of those lingering questions that people might have about this document. And I'm here today with two other of our wizards. One of our wizards has a technology issue today, so can't be with us, but we have the wonderful Susan Owens and the amazing Karla Wiersma, and I'm Monique Attinger. And so we're going to get started. And definitely what we want to do is help to dispel any frustrations, any stress, any intimidation factor that you might be finding with our spreadsheet. We honestly think that this is a great document for people to use, that it can help them understand the playing field of oxalate better. And you can take the food that you're eating now and kind of understand where you're at in terms of your oxalate intake, but also be able to maybe take favorite family recipes and turn them into something that'll be lower oxalate over time. So we really want you to be able to use this thing. And as much as in some cases, people want to make this more simple, there's an advantage to you over the longer haul in leaving some of the complexity in, not the least of which is going to be serving sizes, which we'll talk about. And just right off the bat, the first thing I want to say out of the gate, just to remind folks again, we do not rate foods. We rate serving sizes. So a lot of us on the groups will use kind of a short form of this is a low oxalate food. And while that's fine for conversation, the truth of the matter is this is a low oxalate serving of this food at this amount. So that's really helpful to understand because it means maybe a food that's higher oxalate doesn't have to be off your list. And so a little bit later, I'm going to show you measuring out a low oxalate serving of pecans. Why? Because some of us love them and some of us want to include them in our recipes. And my kids have always enjoyed to have a little bit of something like a pecan on the top of a muffin, for instance. And can you have one pecan on the top of, say, a coconut flour muffin? Yes, you can. It's not going to rise the oxalate in that serving size beyond where it may still be low. So we're going to talk some more about stuff like this, but I would like Karla and Susan to be able to get in here. And so we do have more than just my desire to show you how to handle serving sizes on the agenda for today. So Karla, are you jumping in next or Susan? Oh, Susan, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something quickly because I think a lot of times, we've been told that diets have to be so restrictive that I can't touch anything. And it's like, on or off. I can have it or I can't have it. And I think when we started our low oxalate project 18 years ago, the diets that had been out there were completely restrictive, like you can't touch X. And so they just wanted it to be black and white. And it was really hard when we first started to get people to kind of lighten up a little bit, because really with oxalate, the issue is your total burden. Like how many oxalates are you getting your whole day? And it's not so much that you can't touch a pecan or something like that. And I will say that I think the way human beings work is that when we don't feel like we can't touch something, then we can be a lot like happier. Like, it's not that I can never touch chocolate again. I'm just going to have one chocolate chip rather than 18 chocolate chips in my cookie or whatever. You understand what I'm saying? And if that, you have to know yourself, because if you're one of the people that you just have to live by the rule, oh my gosh, that's one personality type. But there are other personality types that just want to be, a lot more flexible. And so, like, one of the things that I did when I first, started reducing oxalate, my husband didn't want to reduce oxalate at that time. And so he would sometimes order French fries. And I would go, well, can I just have one French fry? And I mean, that's okay, because if that was the only oxalate I was getting, that was, a little bit higher in that meal, that was no big deal to eat one French fry. And so I just want to say, first of all, you need to know who you are, and you need to know how you tick. And if you're one of the people that you have to have hard and fast rules, that's fine. We're not saying that's bad, but we're saying that's not the same as a person that, is a little bit more able to flex a bit to keep certain things available, but not go crazy. Like if you're one of these people that if you have one chocolate chip, you're going to have 50, then maybe you shouldn't have that one chocolate chip. But if you're one of the ones that can do the one chocolate chip and then stop, then that works. Okay.
Yeah.
I'd have to agree with Susan. I mean, when we first started the diet, it was, you can have this, but you can't have that. And that's not how I cook. That's not how my family eats. So, that got me on the journey. Okay, I can't use cumin. Or maybe I can use cumin, and maybe it's just a pinch of it. And how many, so it got me into that whole looking into serving sizes and wanting, once we had, the food list going, wanting to dig into the numbers. Okay, how much, a teaspoon of cumin or a teaspoon of sesame seed? Oh, no, that's not going to happen, because that makes, with all the other ingredients in the recipe, it's just not going to work for us. Half teaspoon might work. Quarter teaspoon might work. Still kind of gives me the flavor. What else can give me that flavor? For cumin, okay, I can add in a little bit of Hatch red chili powder. Similar flavor. That kind of thing. If I can't use coriander, what can I use, as a replacement? I had the food substitution Bible that said, you can use a tiny bit of zest and a little bit of sage, and it gives you the same flavor palette. And even with the zest being not very low, a small amount with the sage was still lower than using coriander on its own. So you can be a little more adventurous if that's what you like. Like Susan said, if you would prefer not, and you would just rather say, you know what, I'm just going to be eating very low and medium foods. That's it. And if that's what you want to do, more power to you. There's 100 different ways to do it. And really no way is wrong. It's not an exclusion diet in the strict sense of the word, although there are probably some things, I'm sorry, spinach is never going to be on my menu, not even a leaf of it. Chard is not going to be on my menu. Unfortunately, plantains are not going to be on my menu, and I grew up with those things.
Rhubarb is not going to be on my menu.
Yeah, I mean, there are just some items that are so high. It's, as much as I love my plantains, I had pain from even one slice because they're that high. So it's just not worth it to put, to put on the menu, but that's a choice that, that I made. So you can, if you can fit a leaf or two of spinach in your menu and that's what you want to do and you can work it, knock yourself out. There's, like I said, there's 100 different ways to do it. You don't have to be gluten and casein free. You don't have to be, standard Western diet. You can do a vegetarian, vegan, keto, gluten-free, casein-free, GAPS, specific carbohydrate. It can work with other diets. Doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be easy, but it's doable.
May I just throw out something, because this is a memory that I have back at the beginning of our project, pretty early. I think I remember when you, Karla, discovered extracts and how they could be used to add flavor to something without adding a lot of the oxalate that was in the raw herb or whatever it was.
Enhanza. That was the first Enhanza, which was a curcumin extract that they were giving to kids on the spectrum. As an antioxidant, antiviral, it's got a whole bunch of benefits, but someone had mentioned that they cooked with it.
Might have been me.
And it was in a powder because they used to sell it in a capsule.
Yeah,
and then you could do a canister with a powder. And someone had actually, I think it was Lee Silsby, had asked the company, can you cook with this? And they're like, yeah, you can cook with it. It looks like turmeric, why not? So, and I was like, well, what else can we use? And that's, then all of a sudden it was ginger, because that was pretty high. Then it was, cinnamon, which isn't quite as good as the real, as the regular cinnamon, but it works. And that got me on, and then I found they had a cumin extract and I was over the moon until they stopped making it. But, because I was like dumping that stuff in,
That's where we need to talk about those holy lama spice extract drops, because they have a cumin drop, they have drops for like a lot of the high oxalate spices. They don't cover everything, but they do cover a lot of the things that would be in South Asian cuisine. And, some of the more basic ones we would think of for, kind of standard cooking in North America, basil and oregano and, those kinds of things. So those give you really good, fresh spice taste. And the ones we tested were the big guns, turmeric, cumin, cinnamon, where you've got a lot of oxalate, in a very reasonable serving, and they were all 0 per drop. So this stuff is amazing.
Yeah.
But mostly we're trying.
You can throw in vegetables. Like if you're making a chili and you want tomatoes, you use some of those spice drops and, you can add in a little bit of tomato for that.
Exactly. Because you're taking your spice component oxalate down to 0. Yep. You can take the spice component down to 0. That gives you room for ingredients. So, we do have more tools now than we did back in the early days, when it was really about, okay, how much spice do I need to put in order to at least get the flavor that I want? And then how can I modify some of my other ingredients like the vegetables so that I will have room in my oxalate budget? And so for us, that meant butternut puree instead of tomato sauce. And that, so we want people to understand there can be some fun here, especially if you like solving a puzzle. Some of this is like solving a puzzle, right? Where do you have wiggle room? Where can you build in wiggle room? What tools allow you to be able to have a little more oxalate over here if you can reduce this thing over in another part of the recipe. So it's not necessarily, as all of us have said, I think so far, all or nothing. There are ways to have a little bit of something that you like.
Yep.
Did you want to just talk through the columns on the spreadsheet one more time, just to give
Sure.
people another chance to see what we mean when we're talking about various columns? Okay, the legend tab. Yes, we can see that.
So that's our legend that just tells you basically what gives you some general information. Here's where we're getting our data from. Here's what the items look like if they're color coded, and this is what they mean.
And lots of people get a little bit confused about the color coding, but please know that if you're trying to go into the spreadsheet and see the new things, this tab tells you how you could point out or isolate the things that are new.
Yep.
And you'll
And then,
see we've used some other color coding. Go ahead.
yes, and we've color coded our levels. So, if you're looking for items, that are low, you're going to see 1 or 2 low, and it's going to be a specific color. And we're going to have some more changes in the future on that, but we'll go into that.
But it starts to give you a little more obvious cues for those of us who don't deal with any level of color blindness. You can start to see the color on the level, and that'll give you an idea of what you're looking at.
Yep. Here's the basic food list, what it looks like, and you can see, we have it grouped by category, by the level, what the item is, what the total oxalate is per 100 gram, soluble, I guess you could say imperial serving size, that serving size in grams. Then you have your calculate oxalate per serving, and that's the total oxalate per serving. How much of that is soluble? What percentage of that is soluble? What reference, that data came from? Did it come from a study? Did it come from the VP Foundation in their updates, the low oxalate cookbook, or some of our in-house testing? And then we have a little notes area, that tells you where, the data is incomplete because we don't really have any information on the soluble data. Or it could be, this is a high oxalate item. Here's a lower oxalate substitute that you might want to consider. Or we have this item listed as gluten-free and casein-free because the color coding covers that, but it's not casein-free. It's just gluten-free, or it's just dairy-free and it's not gluten-free. So we try to provide that, that kind of information.
Before you switch, can we waltz down a row and discuss how the row lays out? And the one I'm thinking of is the one there where it's 142 milligrams of oxalate in a 100-gram serving. Oh, baking products, egg replacer, Bob's Red Mill. That one right there.
Okay.
And the reason I picked this one is that here we have a product where the calc level says medium. I want everybody to understand that calc level is actually our rating, our oxalate rating per serving. Okay. It's called calc level because we've calculated our rating based on the oxalate for the serving. So, the heading may not be illuminating for you if you're new to the group, but it's kind of short form for those of us who have been around for a while. So that's your rating per serving, what you're seeing in column B. Then you've got the item name, which makes sense for everybody. In this case, we've got an item which is in green because this is
Well,
this
that's
the-
yellow. That's actually like a darker yellow. Yeah.
Okay,
And it's one of those that it's dairy free, but it's not gluten free.
perfect. So great explanation of, the fact that we're using some color coding on the name of the item to try and give you some additional information as well. Notice the total oxalate per 100 grams. It's 142. That doesn't look low if you're looking at oxalate per 100 grams. You would never use 100 grams of egg replacer in any recipe unless you were making a batch for 1,000 people. Okay, so there are oxalate ratings. You really have to tie that directly to calc oxalate per serving. That is the amount of oxalate per serving as we've indicated in column H. So the serving size here is 7 grams. That corresponds to 1 tablespoon. And that amount is giving you just about 10 milligrams of oxalate. But again, 1 tablespoon of egg replacers, probably for a recipe the size of a cake or a loaf or something where you're dealing with more than 1 serving. So even though this is medium oxalate, it's very doable. But we want you to understand, you start with the oxalate per 100 grams. You're never going to use 100 grams of egg replacer. Then you have your total soluble oxalate per 100 grams. That's just telling you of the oxalate that's there, these many milligrams are soluble. We give you that information because it can be helpful, but keep in mind the total oxalate is what we count when we're thinking about our diet. We're not just counting soluble. I've heard some people talk about practitioners who are just counting soluble. I absolutely recommend against that, as the rest of the wizards do, because insoluble is less likely to be absorbed, but it's not clear that it can't be absorbed at all, and it may still be causing inflammation and problem in the gut. So you still need to know that it's there. All right, so 1 tablespoon is the amount that we measured. That's a volume measurement. That's how much space it takes up in something. Then we have the weight measurement. That's in grams. So I'll be going through with a scale to show us some of these things. Then calc oxalate per serving is just the amount of oxalate for a typical serving size, 1 tablespoon. Then we've got a calculated soluble oxalate. And the only reason we designate these as calculated is because they're actually done. We've done the math basically based on the oxalate per 100 grams. And similarly for how much soluble is in that measured serving size. And then, as Karla was saying, soluble at the end in percentage.
Well, one of the things, that the lab does is, for the most part, this is the information as they give it to us.
Yeah,
So-
very good point. Yep.
And to dovetail on some of the columns, total oxalate per 100 gram. That's a pretty standard amount from what I've seen across the different labs doing their testing. And basically what that tells me is, if you're going to send an item in for testing, that's the minimum amount that they need. And once they have that, if they decide, like our lab does, to do an oxalate per serving, that 100 gram helps them, get that amount.
Well, and in fact, Dr. Liebman sometimes, for things where we typically use a very small amount, he won't necessarily do a test on a full 100 grams, although he'll still report oxalate per 100 grams. So we can be calculating in either direction, just so that everybody here knows. Because he's perfectly comfortable with doing a smaller amount as long as he can get good enough data on how much oxalate's in it, as opposed to people having to send, larger amounts of stuff into his lab. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
And-
if you've got 50 to 100 milligrams or 100 grams of something, sorry, if you have 50 to 100 grams of the substance that you want tested, that's ideal. But sometimes, like for things like supplements where it's so tiny,
Or spices.
Dr. Liebman will be able to get us our data all across this line, but with a smaller test sample.
Yeah. Well, what I would do is when I would send supplements in for testing, I would just send him, I would send him the bottle.
Yeah, agreed.
Or,
I
or
do
if
the
I
same
was
thing.
getting, an herb or a spice tested, I would get, the bigger bottle, not the little tiny ones that you get at the grocery store. I would get the bigger bottle and send that in. But, for the most part, if you're talking rice, if you're talking flour, if you can send the whole item in, that's probably the best way to do it, because that way they've got enough product there to test.
Right. Yep. So the thing here then is there's lots of ways to use this. And Susan collected up a bunch of things to show you how we do weighing and measuring as well. Go ahead, Susan.
That's not what I was going to talk about.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to explain why they got so obsessed with 100 grams.
Oh,
The
wonderful.
scientists did, because for a long, long time, what they were really interested in was the ratio of calcium to the food per gram. Okay, so they could get the data on how many milligrams of calcium was in a food or something like that. And so they wanted to be able to say, oh, okay, this percent of the weight of this item has this much calcium in it. And so that allowed them to basically tell you which food had a whole lot of calcium on it, so you were less likely to absorb the oxalate. So that's really why that became the standard. And you probably didn't even know that.
No. Yeah, no.
Right.
The other
So
thing.
anyway,
But
yes, Karla.
I was just going to dovetail on a percentage. Why that's useful. Especially, for me, it's grains. If you have, a grain that has a high amount of soluble oxalate, what we found on some of the items that we've tested is if you soak it, and it can be, sometimes it doesn't take a lot, but I generally tend to soak mine for at least 4 to 6 hours, if not longer. And then I boil the grains essentially like I would spaghetti, and then toss the cooking water out. We have found that some items that were very high, like wild rice, or even medium, like brown rice and millet, we were able to reduce the soluble oxalate considerably to where these items were low to low or medium per a half cup serving. So that gives you a lot of options. Now, something like, let's say, quinoa, might be so high that all the boiling and tossing out in the world is still going to leave you with a high product. But if you notice that it's high, it might be something to have the lab test.
Well, and that's where how the food's prepared makes a difference, because we know that it makes people crazy that there's foods raw, there's foods cooked, there's foods, and it may specify that it's boiled or steamed or whatever. But this can make a big difference as well in terms of oxalate in general, because if I'm roasting something in the oven, I'm leaving the oxalate in it. But if I'm boiling something, on the top of the stove, that soluble component, I may be able to get some of that out of the food. And so it can make a difference how you prepare your food as to how much oxalate's in it. And in fact, I've used the opposite aspect of soluble versus insoluble for things like tea. So if I've had people asking me about a particular spice and they say, I make a tea out of it, if it's got a low soluble, then I know that most of the oxalate that's in there is insoluble and not very likely to move into the steeping water. So, you know, we can make use of this percentage soluble in a variety of ways, both to lose oxalate into cooking water when it's soluble, and also if you're looking at something to try and make something as a tea instead of you know, perhaps another way of using a spice whole, then if there's a high percentage of insoluble, then you can be leaving that behind. So this is something where, as you become a bit more nuanced with how you handle your diet, or a bit more ready to take on some new interesting ways to prepare food or to work with ingredients, this can be really helpful. But certainly when it comes to just how your diet goes, count all the oxalate that remains in that food, whether it's soluble or insoluble. Once you're eating it, once you're taking it in, whatever's there is yours. Susan.
I just wanted to say that if you are soaking something or boiling something or whatever, the smaller that you cut it up, the more surface area is on the outside where it is contacting the water. And so it's better, like if say you had a red potato or something like that, if chopping it up into smaller pieces to have more exposure to the water is going to get more of the oxalate to go into the water.
Yeah. So a 1/2 inch dice is better than a 1 inch chop, is better than, you know, big rough pieces. And that's another one of those places where how you prepare the food makes a difference.
Right.
Yeah. So one of the things we're hoping to help people with is the flexibility between a volume measure and a weight. So Susan collected some pictures of the kinds of things that we work with to be able to handle weighing and measuring. Okay.
Now, my daughter has something like this, which is really flat, and you can put it on your counter. It takes up a bit of space, but it's very convenient because it's kind of there, and you have, you know, your little buttons on it to convert from one kind of measurement to another, because you may have a recipe that uses one type of measurement, like an ounce, but yet for using the spreadsheet, you want to convert it into grams. And so this kind of a thing is really nice because it will do all your math for you, which is kind of handy. And then you also have one that says maybe like this. And so with this, I'm just showing this to you because when you put the container that you're putting your food in, you have to X out that the amount of the weight of that container. And so most of these scales have a button that you push where you set it back to 0 after you put the empty container on there, and then you can add whatever it is you're measuring. And that's another thing to kind of point out. Here's another one. I'm just giving you some examples. Now, these are for larger items, but if you are trying to measure something that's really tiny, like an herb or something like that, or a capsule of something, then I like, this is one that I have that will measure a very tiny amount of something. But, you know, one of the things that's kind of a challenge is that you have to have a really little bitty container. You can't put a really heavy thing on top of this little device. And so Karla and I have both got very fond of these little things. And Karla, I'll let you talk about it.
They're basically just condiment cups, that you would put, typically mustard, ketchup, mayonnaise. I used to send these in, when I would send lunches, with my kid, if he wanted something with ketchup, I would give him one of those. It has a little lid. It covers maybe 2 tablespoons or, tablespoon and a half. It can vary, but I would use those for herbs and spices where I was looking at, something small to add to a recipe. I would also use them with supplements where, I was making my own using the bulk supplements, and then I had a little pill capper machine that, so I would weigh out, this is 100 milligrams, this is 150 milligram, put them in a cap it, and then, we would take those. But it's really handy. It doesn't weigh a lot. And again, you just put it on a scale, you hit the tare button, and it clears out the weight of that cup. And then you just add your ingredient, you're good to go.
Yeah, and that button, tare, is T-A-R-E. And basically what you're telling the scale is count this container and set the weight at 0.
Yep.
So that then whatever you add to it, that's what it's measuring. So really, really helpful, really practical kind of scale to have where you can do this kind of functioning. Because obviously, if you've filled up your measuring cup and then you're going to weigh it, the measuring cup's got to weight. You need that not to be counted. And this is what the tare button has. Now, I am going to waltz this into my kitchen, but I'm going to turn my video off so I don't make everybody seasick.
Okay. I wanted to say something else about the scale.
Go ahead.
While you're going, one of the things that I loved about this digital scale is I would experiment with recipes that were in grams, which is not something that I typically would use. That's not how I grew up cooking, but that little scale helped, those scales helped me figure out, okay, this is the equivalent of, a half cup, quarter cup, third cup, tablespoon, teaspoon. So, I could pull up a recipe online, from the UK or Australia, and it would list everything in grams or milliliters, and I wasn't completely lost.
Yeah.
So, I could still use the recipe and then make my little notes. I'd print out the recipe. This is a third cup. This is a quarter cup. This is a teaspoon and a half. And that's, so scale was very handy in multiple ways.
Yeah, because then you can convert a recipe.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to use ordinary, conventional North American style items here. And one of the things I did was cabbage today. So this is actually steamed cabbage. And I had measured out originally 2 cups on here. So I just want to show folks one of the things that seems to create a lot of confusion with our ingredients when you're comparing the oxalate value on something that's cooked to the oxalate value on something that's raw. And then, of course, we have the different ways of preparing. So we may have reduced or changed oxalate levels by how we've cooked. So it can get a little bit confusing, especially when you're at the beginning. That said, what I've done with the cabbage that I chopped was all I did was steam it. So steaming doesn't remove oxalate. It's not like if I'd boiled it where some of the oxalate may have gone into the cooking water. This is a way of preparing the food where I've wilted it. So it's going to have less volume. And this was a great example because this was 2 full cups up here And you can see how it's down now. This is like about a cup and a half. So in terms of volume, I lost half a cup of volume. What does that mean? That means all the oxalate that would have been in a 2-cup serving is now in a cup and a half serving. So you get what kind of looks like a concentration of oxalate when you're cooking it, but it's not really. What it is this is wilted, and we can get more of it into a volume measure. Now, that said, I forgot to tear my scale. So we'll just set that up, and hopefully I'll have some pictures so you can see what the top of the scale actually looks like. And I'm going to do my best Vanna White here. This is my scale.
It looks very much like one of the ones I showed.
Yeah, exactly. So very flat body, but it's got this plate on the top where you can set a bowl, you can set whatever you need to. This one's very simple. It's just got 3 buttons on the front. And if I turn it on, it starts to fire up. You see some things going on here. And ultimately, it will give me a set of zeros. Then I can take this, which obviously has weight to it. I can make sure there's no pieces of cabbage in it, so it's not confusing. This is empty. Put it on, and this all by itself would be 584 grams. Obviously, that's not going to be very helpful in terms of the weight of my cabbage. So I hit the tear button to zero it off. And now this was a cup and a half. And so that's a volume measure. We usually use half a cup for a serving, so that's actually kind of convenient. I can always check what a half cup of cooked cabbage is, and then just multiply by 3 if I've got a cup and a half of cooked cabbage. But most people aren't going to want to like measure it after it's cooked like this. All right, so now I've got it all in my nice little scale. I'll just give you a bit of a view here. It's not perfect, but there you are. And because I was able to correct for the weight of the measuring cup itself, I can now see that's 183 grams. Now, if I was going to figure out how much oxalate's in there, I look at steamed cabbage. I find out oxalate per 100 grams. And then once I've got oxalate per 100 grams, which is right on our sheet, then I can easily figure out what 183 grams is. And in this case, not to make it too much math, but I would multiply what I've got on the spreadsheet at 100 grams by 1.83. Why? Because this is 100 and another 83 grams. So it's actually 1.83 times the number that's on our spreadsheet. So I could have a very specific serving size and sort out the oxalate for myself. And then if I've got a bigger recipe where I'm using something like this, but I'm going to be making it for a family, I can be fairly confident about how much oxalate I've got. Now, I may not always want to weigh and measure everything, but there is a time and a place for it. And one of those places might be things like nuts, things like pecans, we say pecans up here, are the kind of thing where a little bit, like a small serving like this might be very nice in a little kind of trail mix for your kids. You know, this with some raisins, with these chopped up a little bit. And maybe we just want a small serving size, right? So I'm going to put I've got like a little condiment cup here. That's 4 grams. We're going to zero it out. And then I can actually put my pecans in here and figure out how much I've got. What you saw in my hand turns out to be 9 grams. Is that doable, low oxalate? It sure as heck is. Because we've got data on our spreadsheet, which looks at a serving size for an ounce. That's 28 grams. This is only like about a quarter of an ounce. You can easily have something like this. So being able to measure my little cup, zero that out, and then just measure a few pecans, and you know, you can make some decisions then. Does somebody have some raisins, a few of these, a couple of pretzel sticks, and maybe that's the snack for your kid? You know, that might work really well, right? Without it having to be all or nothing. Okay. Can do the same sort of thing with something like,
Can I throw out too that if you have something that you think, well, I'm going to do this again, then figure out, okay, I could do 4 of these, 4 pecans are good. I mean, like, figure out what it is that.
and that's exactly what that was. It was about 4 pecans.
Right. So then you kind of know what each pecan is per each. And then maybe one time you have a little bit more leverage and can use more than you did in the recipe for, a different recipe. And
Right.
so, write these things down if there's something that you think your family kind of has a hankering to.
Great idea. Because then you don't have to weigh and measure every time. There's not that much difference between the size of one pecan half and another. So if you had a serving size that worked, at one point I had measured 5 macadamia nuts. Why? This family loves macadamia nuts. And if I could put those 5 macadamia nuts in a trail mix with my kids, where they had like white chocolate chips and a few gluten-free pretzels and some raisins, they had something that looked like what everybody else at school had. And it was made so that it was safe for them. And, things like that can be incredibly helpful. So last but not least, you can even do this with a scale with one of these guys. So I've got nice flat bottomed metal measuring spoons. Let's say for some reason you had a recipe where you wanted to use some extra basil. So I'm going to find out how much this is worth first. Yeah, like my measuring spoon alone, because it's actually steel, is 33 grams. We would not want the scale counting that. So I've now zeroed it out. Let's say I wanted a nice tablespoon of basil. So I can now put this on the scale. Do you know a tablespoon of basil is only 3 grams? So then again, if you've got your oxalate per 100 grams for something like this, I would take the oxalate per 100 grams, divide it by 100 so that I'm getting the oxalate for 1 gram. And that is really simple. Whatever that number is for 100 grams, you move the decimal place 2 places. Not complicated math. So don't think that just because we're talking about these things and it seems intimidating, we're trying to help you handle this as simply as possible. So then I want to use my 3 grams worth of basil. It's absolutely simple. My oxalate per gram that I figured out from my 100 gram and multiply by 3. And then I might see, oh, well, maybe that's giving me a bit more oxalate than I'd like. So then maybe I tweak some of my other ingredients. Like if we're talking about things like tomato sauces, Karla and I have both discussed this topic endlessly on our friendly virtual coffee clatches every week. But switch out tomatoes for butternut puree, switch out some of the tomato and leave some in. Like there's all kinds of variations you can do, which then allow you to have a food that works for you and be able to work with a recipe that you've got with ingredients that you've got in your kitchen, as long as you're able to just handle a scale, your regular measuring implements, and being able to measure in grams.
And be sure you have a calculator around.
Oh yeah.
I mean, usually you have something on your phone that can work.
Okay, I'm going to walk with everybody this time. No reason to be intimidated by, well, maybe that sounds not so good. We don't want you to be intimidated by some of this because it really can be handled quite simply. We just have to give ourselves a chance to work with the spreadsheet a bit and understand that we can have this kind of flexibility where we don't have to make things all or nothing, but also understanding that sometimes how you process a food changes it. So I had less cabbage after it was cooked, all the oxalate's still in there. So if I've measured up my raw ingredient and it wilts, and we were talking about leafy greens earlier, like some of these leafy greens just disappear as you cook them. Then if you've measured out your raw ingredient, there's no confusion about what's left in your recipe afterwards because you measured out your raw ingredient. You can figure out what the oxalate was. The only time we have more confusion there is if we're processing it in a way that might remove some oxalate, but that's to your favor if you're doing something where you can get some of the oxalate out. Okay. Anything else, ladies?
Karla, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, Karla, you're still on mute.
Yep, the project
Yes.
that we were talking about with the uncalculated items, that some of the uncalculated items that we have on our food list from studies.
Yes.
We don't have a calculated item, calculated oxalate per serving on a lot of these items, but we do have the weight, the total oxalate per 100 grams and the soluble oxalate in other cases. So one of the things that I thought was, if we could get members to actually weigh some of these items in grams and send me the information, via email or post it on the Facebook group, I can calculate those items and at least give us a general idea of what we're dealing with oxalate per serving. What would be, I think, is kind of a win-win situation is if you happen, a lot of these studies are in, southern China, Taiwan, Japan, Sweden. So if we have members that are actually living in that area, and I have a niece who lives in Taiwan, and she's already sending me some information on some of those items, is she can look at that data and say, yeah, this is probably not going to work for me because it's too high. But if we can actually give our overseas members some data from where they are, because we know that oxalate levels are going to vary based on region. So an apple grown here is not necessarily going to have the same oxalate level as the apple in Japan or the apple in southern China, or the button mushroom in Sweden is not going to be necessarily the same as what we grow here.
And even the names change. Sometimes they use the same name for very different products.
Very different products. Yeah.
But if we can get that data from our overseas members, then it helps them. It helps us, because if we have, we have a lot, like Monique was saying before, we have Asian markets here, and a lot of that produce is shipped. So it gives us a good idea of some of these items that we normally wouldn't have access to. Well, suddenly, hey, pak choi might be on the menu.
Well, and what we're really after is like an average serving size, right? So if we're talking about something like a mushroom, it may be one mushroom is a suitable weighed measured item. But if we're talking about like we had dragon fruit here once, the weight for a half cup serving might be really helpful. So if we can kind of get some of these, if you will, sort of average or typical serving sizes, like with some of our spices, we have tablespoons, but with some of our spices, we have teaspoons because it tends to be the amount that is more frequently used in a recipe. So if anybody out there is got some of these foods that are in our uncalc category, we might be able to just convert those into things that we can give a rating to based on a serving size and be able to open them up to people in a way that right now they might look a little intimidating.
Oh, and I just wanted to point out, because I don't think we've clarified this quite yet, is that if you have something like, I'm just going to say potato because everybody knows what a potato looks like. But if you dice it where it's like any teeny tiny little pieces, you're going to get a whole lot more in a 1 cup or a 2 cup container than you are if you give it in huge big places, because if you have big pieces, then there's a lot of space in there that doesn't have anything in there. And so just be aware of the discrepancies, even in a recipe. You know, some things like a cup of flour, I mean, that's kind of the same, you know, from one recipe to another recipe. But if it's something that either smushes, like, for instance, if you're measuring cilantro, a cup of my cilantro and a cup of your cilantro may be very different because it may depend on how much you smushed it down. And so
or how finely you chopped it, or how, if it was wilted, or if it was frozen before you measured it. There's so many things that can affect, that volume.
That's right. And so that's why when you're talking about something that's very, for lack of a better word, I'll say smushable. If it's something that you can smush, then you really want to use the weight, because the weight is going to be pretty much the same, you know, whether you smush it or you don't smush it. So that's just a real easy hint there for people.
And that, and I just want to say again, when I originally chopped my 2 cups of cabbage, I ended up with a cup and a half after just steaming it. So, and before we got on here, my husband was in the background saying things like, yeah, and if you stir fried it, it would be even smaller. So volume measurements are a reasonable place to start. When I first started this diet, I could not wrap my head around how I was going to handle some foods. So I stuck with a volume measurement because I found it simple. And we know that some of you are in that place too, but we really encourage you to either weigh and then figure out what the weight is in a volume measurement so you can convert recipes, or just think of it maybe as kind of a puzzle to play with. So it doesn't perhaps have the same level of intimidation factor if we just think of it as a puzzle that you can play with. And honestly, it's not about precision, although we're talking about that a bit in this conversation. It's more about how you bias your diet overall. And what I found over time as I did this is my body had a little bit of tolerance. Did we do better if we stayed in kind of a 60 to 80 milligram range in a day? Yes. But if I was at 85 one day or 55 another, my body could handle those kinds of variations. So if you're a little bit off in a calculation, or if the number's not perfect enough because your local cabbage has more oxalate than somebody else's local cabbage for reasons we might not know, it shouldn't mean the end of the world. You should be able to have some tolerance there. So we encourage you to play and think of it as play, and also to recognize that there isn't a perfect way to do this diet. There's just a reasonable way for you to do it where you feel good and it works for you.
Yep. And we've tried to help out where we can with the food list. So if you know that a half cup of something is high, since we have the numbers, one of the things that I've tried to do is say, okay, a half cup of this, let's say flour, a half cup of this flour is high. Well, guess what? I decided, well, what's a quarter cup going to be like? And yeah, that's medium. Or, hey, this is actually, it's at the lower end of the scale. It's doable. So, and we've tried to do that, with spices. A teaspoon of this may be high, but half teaspoon, quarter teaspoon may be a lot more doable. And then, or just a plain substitution like nutmeg. Nutmeg is medium. Use mace. It's comes from the same, the same plant. Flavor is a little bit different. Not enough to be really noticeable, but that's very low oxalate.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Those are great examples.
I just want to throw out too that we have members in something like 127 different countries. And it really may be that wherever you live, that what you're eating is not what's in our spreadsheet yet. And I know that's frustrating. But I want to say that especially if you're in a foreign language, place where you speak a very different language, you may be able to find a university that is in your area where they've actually tested some foods. And we would love to know about that if you have access to information like that, because we're not trying to leave anybody out. But we also, have a testing group. And so if something is like, I can't live without knowing about this, I can't just decide not to eat it because I don't know what it is, whether it's high or low or medium or something, then that might be more of an opportunity for you to get it from any way that you can and get it to our testing group so that it can eventually be tested. So, we're going to get there. We're going to try to make collaborations with other research institutes and things like that to be able to test more foods. But we're not leaving you out. We just are trying to get as much done as we can.
Yeah, juggling as fast as I can. I'm the person who runs the testing group. So
yes,
one of the things that has been really helpful is where people have said something is a staple for them. And so we have had some interesting food testing projects where we covered some staples from Nigeria. We could do that again. And if you've got ideas of foods that need to be tested and you don't have somebody local, we might be able to sort out a way for you to be able to get a food to our lab. So, keep an open mind. And if you've got things which are really important foods in your cuisine, for whatever reason, let's see if we can find a way to get those foods tested.
And Monique, how much is it costing right now to do like one item?
Right now, one item is $60 US.
Okay.
So the other thing that there's still a couple of people who are trying to coordinate locally with companies where the intention was to try and get these companies to test their food products. So that's another thing where I think maybe we could have people who, their local gluten-free brand or their local, processed food of one kind or another. Maybe there's a way to encourage the manufacturers of these products to be able to get them tested so that we have a better idea about what those products are offering to people.
Wonderful. We just want to serve as many people as we can, but we have, we're just, limited resources. So we try to get to things as fast as we can, but we haven't forgotten you. We just are trying to figure out how to do it.
Yeah. So anybody who's got great ideas and who's a current member of the Trying Low Oxalates group on Facebook or on Groups.io, feel free to consider joining the TLO testing group. And if you've got great ideas, we're all ears.
Yep.
Okay. Well, we have managed to go through an hour. my dear friends. And we're hoping again that we're giving you some more tools, some more ways of understanding how to use the spreadsheet. If you have questions, reach out. The TLO spreadsheet group is a very active little place where we talk all things food test results, and how to figure out what the oxalate is in a food. And sometimes we fess up that we don't know either, but we're in this boat together. We're doing our best. And the triangle oxalates group, either of those groups on either Facebook or Groups.io, great places for you to learn more and be able to be in a community where we're all together in this boat, this low oxalate boat. So anything else from either of my fellow wizards?
Well, I just want to say that you may find that there are oxalate lists out there on the internet, and their results may not agree with ours because they were tested by a different company. We have no idea about growing conditions or varieties or anything like that. So,
or the test procedures that they use, what their testing protocol was. Yeah.
Right. So I just want to say, don't freak out. The reason that we decided to do this whole spreadsheet thing, and it got more and more complicated through the years because it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. But the reason we did that was that we were trying to resolve some of the issues of differences in this place and that place. So just don't let it get your heart upset because we're doing the best we can, and it's always going to be an approximation. It's never going to be certain because there's so much information that we don't have about products, like what variety they are and growing conditions and that sort of thing. So just kind of try to live light on this subject.
Yeah. And with that, thank you, everyone. And we will be posting this to the group in the next few days. And if people have any questions, you can ask on the group. And in the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are. And we're signing off from the Wizards of Ox. Thanks, everyone.